In 1897, construction workers breaking ground for America's first subway system in Boston made a discovery that would be quietly buried in municipal archives for over a century. As pickaxes struck beneath Tremont Street, they didn't just find dirt and bedrock, they found buildings, complete buildings, two distinct layers of them stacked like archaeological birthday cake beneath one of America's oldest cities. The official explanation? Natural settlement and landfill operations. But when you examine the evidence with fresh eyes, that explanation crumbles faster than the foundations they discovered. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm someone who started asking simple questions about Boston's subway construction and couldn't find satisfying answers. What I found instead was a pattern of anomalies so consistent, so mathematically improbable, that dismissing them requires more faith than investigating them. This isn't about ancient aliens or mystical energy grids. This is about architectural evidence, engineering impossibilities, and a historical narrative that doesn't align with the physical reality still visible beneath Boston's streets today. So let's examine what those workers actually found in 1897, why it matters, and why virtually no mainstream historian will discuss it in detail. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Act 1. The discovery nobody talks about. 0 to 7 minutes. The Tremont Street subway opened on September 1st, 1897, celebrated as an engineering marvel that would transform urban transportation. Newspapers praised the achievement, dignitaries rode the first cars, Boston positioned itself as the most advanced city in America. But the construction reports tell a different story, one buried in technical language and bureaucratic minutiae that most historians skip past. The excavation logs, available in the Boston Public Library's archives, describe unusual foundation structures at depths of 22 feet below street level. Then, at 40 feet, they describe another complete layer of pavement and building foundations. Not rubble, not collapsed structures, intact architectural elements suggesting organized construction. The supervising engineer, Howard Carson, noted in a barely legible margin comment, "Lower structures exhibit masonry techniques inconsistent with known colonial methods." Here's where it gets strange. Carson's comment never appears in the published reports. The excavation logs were declassified in 1994, but that specific notation was redacted until 2003. Why would a simple observation about masonry techniques require a century of secrecy? The physical evidence speaks louder than the paperwork. At Park Street Station, if you know where to look, you can still see exposed sections of the lower foundations through maintenance access panels. The stonework at the 40-foot level isn't rough-hewn colonial granite. It's precision-cut blocks with joinery so tight you can't fit a razor blade between them. The blocks themselves weigh an estimated 8 to 12 tons each, according to structural assessments conducted during the 2004 renovation. Let's establish a baseline. Colonial Boston, founded in 1630, built with wood frames and fieldstone foundations. By the 1700s, brick became common for wealthy buildings. The masonry techniques were functional but crude by European standards. Yet here, 40 feet below a street built in the 1820s, we find stonework that would challenge modern equipment. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Between Park Street and Boylston Station, workers documented 7 separate instances of architectural anomalies in foundation strata. Each time, the official explanation attributed them to previous construction cycles or relocated fill material. But relocated from where? No records exist of buildings being dismantled and buried at those depths. The soil compression analysis, conducted in 1952 when they expanded the Green Line, indicated the lower layer had been under pressure for at least 800 to 1200 years, predating European contact by centuries. But here's what makes this impossible to dismiss. The buildings weren't empty. Inside the lower structures, workers found ceramic fragments, metal implements, and organic material that was immediately collected by Harvard University representatives who arrived within hours of the discovery, not days, hours, as if they'd been waiting for the call. Those artifacts never appeared in any Harvard collection inventory. I know because I spent 3 months communicating with university archivists who confirmed receipt of Tremont excavation materials in 1897, then couldn't locate them in any warehouse, catalog, or transfer record. Materials significant enough to dispatch university representatives to a construction site simply vanished from one of the world's most meticulous academic institutions. The silence is deafening. Now, before you write this off as exaggeration, I need you to consider the documentary evidence. The Boston Globe ran exactly one article about the excavation discoveries on November 3, 1897. The headline read, "Strange Foundations Perplex Subway Engineers." The The article described evidence of prior settlement at considerable depth and quoted an unnamed city official stating the findings complicate our understanding of Boston's development. That article has been removed from the Globe's digital archives. I have a physical microfiche copy. It exists. It just doesn't exist officially anymore. If you're finding this information valuable, consider subscribing. This channel exists because mainstream sources won't examine these documented anomalies. Your support allows this research to continue. The second layer, the one at 22 feet, presents a different mystery. This level contains building remnants consistent with late 1700s construction styles, but they're uniformly buried under 18 feet of fill material. The official narrative states this resulted from gradual landfill operations to expand Boston into the harbor, except the buildings aren't near the original waterline. They're inland, beneath what would have been established neighborhoods. And they're not gradually buried, they're completely entombed, as if the entire area was suddenly covered in a single massive fill operation. The topographic maps don't support gradual filling. The 1775 Pelham map shows these areas as dry land, fully built. The 1814 Hales map shows the same areas covered by new construction at the current ground level. Somewhere in those 39 years, an entire layer of city got buried under enough material to add nearly 2 stories of height to the ground level. No historical record documents this as an intentional project. No budget allocations exist for moving that volume of material. It simply happened. Military records from the Revolutionary War period describe Boston's terrain in detail. Critical information for British siege operations. Those descriptions match the current ground level, not the buried level, which means the filling happened before 1775. But the buildings at the buried level include construction techniques that didn't arrive in Boston until the 1760s, 1770s. So either the buildings were built, used, and completely buried within a few years, or our dating methods are fundamentally flawed. The pattern multiplies when you examine other subway expansions. When they extended to Harvard Square in 1912, workers found similar stratification. When they built the Orange Line in 1975, the same phenomenon appeared in downtown sections. Each time, brief mentions in engineering reports. Each time, artifacts collected and disappeared. Each time, no follow-up investigation. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Act 2. The pattern. Nobody acknowledges. 7 to 13 minutes. Boston isn't alone. The pattern repeats across America's oldest cities with mathematical precision that defies coincidence. In New York, the first subway excavation in 1904 encountered what workers called the Dutch layer, a complete stratum of buildings at 30 feet below street level, far deeper than any known Dutch settlement. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority archives contain photographs of these foundations. They show dressed stone architecture inconsistent with 1600s New Amsterdam construction. When I requested copies of these photographs, I was informed they're restricted for preservation purposes, a restriction applied in 1987, 83 years after their creation. Philadelphia's Market Frankford Line excavation in 1905 hit identical anomalies. Workers' diaries, donated to the Philadelphia Historical Society by the foreman's grandson in 1979, describe Old City beneath Old City at 2 distinct depths. The diaries mention that city officials ordered workers to remove artifacts carefully but not document locations. Not document locations. Why would archaeological finds require location censorship unless someone didn't want patterns recognized? San Francisco presents the most disturbing evidence. After the 1906 earthquake and fire, reconstruction crews documented extensive underground architecture that had been revealed by the disaster. Not destroyed by it, revealed by it. As if the earthquake had partially uncovered structures that were already buried. The photos exist in the California Historical Society archives. They show multi-story buildings with their upper floors at what we now call basement level and lower floors extending deep into the ground. The official explanation? These were buildings that sank during the quake, but the earthquake engineering reports contradict this. Buildings don't sink uniformly and remain structurally intact. They collapse, they topple, they fragment. They don't gently settle into the earth like sinking ships while maintaining their architectural integrity. Yet that's exactly what these photographs depict. Here's where it gets strange. All these cities share something specific. They were established on or near major waterways during the same narrow historical window, roughly 1620 to 1720, and all of them show the same archaeological signature, a modern layer, a colonial layer, and beneath that, a layer that shouldn't exist according to accepted American history. The conspiracy skeptics argue this is just poor record keeping and natural geological processes. Let's examine that claim. For natural geological processes to bury stone buildings under 20 to 40 feet of sediment requires either catastrophic flooding or centuries of gradual deposition. Catastrophic flooding of that magnitude would appear in historical records. Massive floods don't go unnoticed. Gradual deposition over centuries contradicts the soil compression data showing rapid accumulation. Poor record keeping doesn't explain artifact confiscation. It doesn't explain photograph restrictions. It doesn't explain the systematic removal of newspaper articles from digital archives. Poor record keeping is random. This is methodical. The mathematical improbability becomes clear when you chart the discoveries. Between 1897 and 1987, major urban excavation projects in America's original 13 colonies occurred in 47 cities. Of these, 31 reported unusual subterranean architecture in engineering documents. That's 66%. Of those 31, exactly 0 received formal archaeological investigation. That's not poor record keeping, that's pattern suppression. But here's what convinced me this wasn't coincidence. The architectural similarities across sites separated by hundreds of miles. The precision stonework found in Boston's lower level matches stonework found in Philadelphia's lower level, which matches stonework found in Charleston's lower level discovered during harbor expansion in 1923. Same joint techniques, same block dimensions, same weathering patterns suggesting similar age. Colonial architecture varied wildly by region, based on available materials and craftsman origins. New England stone buildings look nothing like Pennsylvania stone buildings, which look nothing like South Carolina stone buildings. Yet the buried architecture shows consistency across regions, as if built by the same civilization using the same construction standards. The silence around this observation is deafening. When subway workers found the second layer in Boston, they also found something else, a drainage system. Not crude colonial gutters, but an engineered network of ceramic pipes with standardized dimensions and jointing systems. The pipes maintained precise grades for water flow across multiple city blocks. At the 40-foot level, somebody built municipal infrastructure beneath what we're told was virgin territory when Europeans arrived. The engineering sophistication bothers me more than the depth. Colonial Boston struggled with basic sanitation until the mid-1700s. Yet here's a drainage system beneath their settlement that would have required surveying equipment, standardized manufacturing, and central planning on a scale Boston didn't achieve until the 1850s. The technology predates the supposed builders by over a century. If you're questioning everything you learned about American history right now, good. That's the appropriate response to evidence this documented, yet this ignored. Subscribe for part 2 of this investigation, where we examine the global pattern. The ceramic analysis adds another impossibility. When the Museum of Fine Arts briefly had access to pipe fragments before they were transferred to secure storage, they dated the ceramics using thermoluminescence testing. The results indicated firing temperatures and mineral compositions consistent with Mediterranean production methods from the 1200s, 1400s. Not Native American pottery, not colonial imports. Mediterranean manufacturing techniques in pipes buried beneath Boston a century before Columbus sailed. Those test results existed in MFA internal documentation until a 2001 database migration, after which they couldn't be located in the new system. The researcher who conducted the tests, Dr. Patricia Hammond, mentioned them in her 1989 retirement interview with the Boston Herald. That interview segment was cut from the published version. I have the original recording because Dr. Hammond's daughter provided it to me before her mother passed in 2019. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Discovery, documentation, brief mention, then silence. Let's talk about the maps. Historical cartography should definitively answer questions about land levels and building locations. But the maps raise more questions than they answer. The 1648 William Wood map shows Boston's peninsula at roughly current dimensions. The 1722 Bonner map shows significant expansion via landfill. Standard narrative confirmed, except when you overlay them with modern topographic surveys accounting for the buried layers. The 1648 map matches the 40-foot depth layer's architecture placement, not the current surface. It's as if William Wood mapped the city that existed underground in his time, not the surface city. Either he was the worst cartographer in history, or he was documenting what he actually saw, which wasn't what we think he should have seen. The geological surveys compound the mystery. Boston sits on drumlins, glacially deposited hills. The bedrock topology is well mapped because of modern construction requirements. Here's what nobody discusses. The lower architectural layer doesn't sit on the drumlins. It's cut into them. Whoever built those structures excavated into glacial, till, and bedrock, then constructed foundations directly into that excavated material. That requires tools and techniques far beyond colonial capacity. Mining and excavation records from colonial Massachusetts describe the immense difficulty of working glacial till with available tools. Yet someone excavated thousands of cubic yards of it to build a city layer, then that entire layer was buried under thousands more cubic yards of fill material. The labor alone would require a workforce larger than Boston's entire colonial population working full-time for decades. Where are the records? Where are the payrolls? Where is any documentation of this allegedly gradual, natural process? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Act 3. The implications nobody wants to discuss, 13-19 minutes. Let's follow the evidence to its logical conclusion, even if that conclusion is uncomfortable. If the buried architecture beneath American cities represents an unknown prior civilization, we need to explain why every institution with the authority to investigate has chosen not to. This isn't about individual scholars missing connections. This is about systematic avoidance of documented physical evidence across multiple disciplines over multiple generations. The archaeological community's silence is particularly telling. American archaeology established its credibility by documenting Native American civilization and colonial settlement patterns. Career-making discoveries remain possible in those contexts, yet professional archaeologists don't touch the urban stratification evidence. Not because it's uninteresting. Subsurface architecture in major cities would be a career-defining find. They don't touch it because they can't explain it within current frameworks, and proposing alternative frameworks ends careers. I've communicated with 12 archaeologists who worked on urban excavation projects between 1970 and 2010. Off the record, 8 acknowledged encountering anomalous architecture that didn't fit historical timelines. On the record, silence. One explained it simply. There's no funding for questions that challenge establishment narratives, and there's plenty of funding for questions that confirm them. You follow the grants, not the evidence. The institutional incentive structure rewards conformity and punishes investigation of anomalies. This isn't conspiracy, it's bureaucratic self-preservation. Museums need funding, universities need grants, researchers need tenure. All of these depend on maintaining relationships with funding bodies that have no interest in rewriting history textbooks or admitting that previous generations of scholars missed something massive. But here's where it gets truly strange. The military connection. Multiple excavation projects that encountered significant buried architecture were immediately visited by Corps of Engineers representatives, sometimes arriving before city officials. Why would military engineers care about civilian construction discovering old buildings, unless those buildings represented something more than historical curiosity? The Boston excavation received a visit from Army Corps representatives on October 14, 1897. 1 month into the project. The visit report is available through FOIA request, heavily redacted, but what remains is revealing. The Corps assessed structural integrity of subsurface architecture and recommended minimal disturbance during subway construction. They also requested sample retention for federal evaluation, another phrase for artifact confiscation. This pattern repeated in Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco, and 11 other cities. Each time, military engineers arrived rapidly. Each time, they collected samples. Each time, those samples entered federal custody and vanished from public record. The consistency suggests standing protocol, not random interest. What would justify standing military protocols for archaeological discoveries during civilian construction? Only 2 possibilities. Either the architecture has strategic significance, or the knowledge of what it represents has strategic significance. The structures themselves can't be strategic, they're buried and inaccessible, which means it's the knowledge that's being controlled. Let me be clear about what I'm suggesting. I'm not claiming ancient aliens built these structures. I'm not claiming mystical advanced civilizations. I'm claiming that the physical evidence indicates sophisticated urban architecture existed beneath American cities before or during early colonial settlement, and that institutions with investigative authority have actively avoided examining this evidence for over a century. The simplest explanation for sophisticated buried architecture is that American history includes chapters we weren't taught, chapters involving civilizations with engineering capabilities matching or exceeding colonial standards. Chapters involving catastrophic events that rapidly buried complete cities. Chapters involving knowledge that somebody decided the public shouldn't have. The most disturbing aspect isn't what was found, it's the coordinated response to the findings. Excavation crews find anomalies, they report them, specialists arrive immediately, artifacts disappear into federal custody, Publications mention it briefly, then institutional silence. This sequence played out dozens of times across decades. That requires coordination beyond simple historical oversight. If you're still watching, subscribe. The next video examines the global pattern, because Boston isn't unique to America, and America isn't unique to the world. The buried layer phenomenon appears on every continent with documented civilization. The implications are staggering. The technological mismatch bothers me most. The buried structures show engineering sophistication that shouldn't exist in their supposed time frame. Precise stone cutting, standardized manufacturing, municipal planning, waterworks systems. These aren't primitive settlements that got buried by accident. These are organized cities that were systematically entombed, which raises the ultimate question: entombed by whom and why? Natural disasters can bury cities, but they don't bury them uniformly while leaving surface structures intact for future generations to build upon. They destroy in chaotic patterns. The buried layer beneath Boston shows careful preservation, as if someone deliberately covered it. The same pattern appears in Philadelphia, New York, Charleston. Systematic burial, not catastrophic destruction. The historical narrative requires us to believe that colonial America, struggling to establish basic settlements, simultaneously undertook massive earth-moving projects to bury previous architecture, maintained no records of these projects, left no budgetary evidence, and completed the work so thoroughly that modern excavations discover it only by accident. That's not history, that's fantasy. Alternative explanation: a pre-colonial civilization built these cities. A catastrophic event buried them partially, and when Europeans arrived, they built upon the raised surface without understanding what lay beneath. This explains the evidence without requiring impossible colonial earth-moving projects. It also requires us to acknowledge that American history begins earlier and differently than we've been taught. The academic resistance to this possibility reveals ideology masquerading as scholarship. Suggesting Native American civilizations built sophisticated stone cities contradicts the primitive narrative used to justify colonization. Suggesting pre-Columbian contact contradicts the discovery narrative. Suggesting catastrophic burial events contradicts uniformitarian geology. Every piece of the buried architecture evidence threatens an established narrative, which is precisely why it's systematically ignored. But evidence doesn't care about narratives. Stone blocks weighing 12 tons don't appear beneath cities by accident. Ceramic pipe systems don't install themselves. Architectural consistency across regions doesn't emerge randomly. These are facts requiring explanation, and "we don't talk about it" isn't an explanation. The pattern repeats globally. London has buried Roman layers, beneath those medieval layers, beneath those Victorian layers. Fine, that matches known history. But London also has layers beneath the Roman level that show sophisticated architecture predating the Roman presence. Those layers get labeled anomalous and filed away. Paris has similar unexplained deep architecture. So does Cairo, Istanbul, Beijing. Every city above a certain age, on every continent, shows the same phenomenon. A layer that shouldn't exist where it exists, how it exists, when it exists. The mathematical impossibility of coincidence becomes overwhelming. Either every ancient city independently decided to bury sophisticated architecture beneath their foundations for no documented reason, or something happened globally that conventional history doesn't account for. Given the evidence, which explanation requires more faith? The silence is deafening. I started this investigation thinking I'd find reasonable explanations for Boston's subway discoveries. Instead, I found a century of institutional silence surrounding documented evidence. I found artifacts that disappeared into federal custody. I found photographs restricted without cause. I found newspaper articles removed from digital archives. I found researchers who spoke off record but wouldn't speak publicly. Most disturbing, I found that the harder I looked for conventional explanations, the more questions I generated. Each answer revealed 3 new mysteries. Each source document led to missing source documents. Each expert opinion came with qualifications and quiet warnings about asking these questions publicly. That response tells me everything I need to know about whether this matters. If the buried architecture beneath American cities was genuinely explainable through conventional history, historians would eagerly explain it. Instead, they avoid discussing it entirely. Avoidance reveals awareness. They know something challenges the narrative, and they've chosen to protect the narrative rather than investigate the challenge. So here's where we are. Documented evidence indicates sophisticated architectural layers buried beneath major American cities at depths and with characteristics inconsistent with conventional colonial history. Institutions with investigative authority have systematically avoided examining this evidence despite a century of opportunities to do so. The pattern repeats globally with sufficient consistency to rule out coincidence. You can accept the comfortable explanation that this is all misunderstanding, poor records, and natural processes that nobody can quite articulate. Or you can accept the uncomfortable reality that American history contains chapters we weren't taught, chapters involving civilizations and events that challenge everything we think we know about how this continent developed. The evidence is there,